We're live to discuss Giardello. There he is, taking on James Bond. Of course, that's when the actor was younger. Right, so
You can
and
say it's from
there,
the early G.
the mid-70s. About, I think this was the what was it? Not the Living Daylights. You Live and Let Die. That's it. The one with Paul McCartney music. And there he is in Alien. He's been everywhere. This guy. Right. So this is something I'd like to show people as, because some people might be skeptical that there are types. And this is, and we're not going to go over this a lot, so you can just pause this, folks, if you wanted this. And this is what Carl Jung himself wrote about types, that they're really just patterns and that some people can fit the type very well. And we're going to make the case of Giardello, even though he's a fictional character, that he at least fits the sort of the type pattern of ESTJ quite well. This is just a quick concept that you can pause. This is an idea that you've got two sorts of people. So somebody like Munch would talk in a lot of, say the one at the top, the abstract kind of words, because you got Munch talking about theories and things. And pretty much everybody else is going to talk in a concrete way. So all of those ones that are below. So all of the concrete types: elemental, specific, empirical, detailed, factual, indicative, literal, signal. And the abstract types will be the other ones. See, we can go quickly. And then this is something about words and tools, meaning that, as we see here, cooperative, law-abiding, observe social rules. These are like G and Stan the Man and Bayliss and all the other SJs in the series. And then these ones are just more think for themselves, especially somebody like Kellerman. Just the most effective way possible, you know, legal or not. And you certainly saw that with Kellerman when he took out Mahoney. He didn't go by standard procedure there, because standard procedure was not to shoot him. Right, now we can get on the profile. You see how quickly we went through the theory there, Jeff?
Yeah.
Just banged through it. Oh yeah, here's a little thing here about, we can say about Guardians. So Jeff, seeing as your voice is more understandable to Americans than mine, maybe we should alternate it. If you take the first paragraph.
All right. These concrete cooperators, as I like to call them, Plato's guardians, Aristotle's proprietaries, Galen's melancholics, Myers-Briggs SJs,
Yeah.
have a tightly configured personality so that each trait of character entails the other traits. This means that Mother Nature does not permit guardians any more than other types to pick and choose their traits. If their environment enables them to develop a given trait, it can only be one that is predetermined by their temperament.
Right. So I'll do the next one. While it is useful to think of each of the four temperaments as a single unified configuration of attitudes and actions, individual members of each temperament clearly differ from one another. Thus, all the guardians seem to have a great capacity for logistical reliability, but some, the tough-minded SJs, are drawn to the directive role of administrator of policies and procedures, while others, the friendly SJs, such as Bayliss, prefer the informative role of conservator of people and property. These two divisions can be further broken down to reflect an expressive, so almost that's like gregarious or extroverted, or a reserved social attitude. With the administrators, so we think that Giardello fits in that category, with the administrators tending to play the role variants of supervisor, and G does that, or inspector, and inspector as in inspecting things to see if things are complying to how they should be. So you could almost say that an accountant is an inspector.
Yeah. From Homicide, Stanley Bolander would be an example of an ISTJ inspector.
Yeah, so what we could do, before we get on to G, we can say which characters we think are guardians.
You want me to go first?
Well, okay, I'll name the ones that I can remember, and then you can come in. So we think GIARDELLO. So he's directive. He's a bit more tough-minded, and he's extroverted. He's expressive. As you said, Stanley Bolander. He's a bit more reserved, but he's still sort of directive, a bit tough-headed. We think that what was the Garty? Stuart Garty might be ISFJ, so a little more tender-hearted and reserved. We think that Tim Bayliss is tender-hearted, and we had a discussion for a while between whether Bayliss was expressive or whether he was more reserved. And we sort of came to the conclusion, and we'll go over Bayliss in the future, about how he was more of a type called the protector, because he was even protecting his uncle on the level of taking care of him, with the uncle that abused him.
That was really the part that clinched it for me, how he would fit more in the protector, because he was, I think the ESFJs might have drawn the line there and not taken care of the uncle that abused them. I guess maybe some of them would, but that struck me as a little hardcore on the protector side.
Yeah, because the ESFJs, when they get upset with people, they can bring the force.
Yeah, and plus with Bayliss, like the times where he is more expressive, it seems more uncomfortable. He doesn't seem as comfortable with it as somebody like G.
Yeah, and also, so there was even a time when G got him by the collar and held him up. And then there are other times where Bayliss can show, because he's a big guy. I think when somebody called his friend Frank the N-word, he kneed him in the head. He just got his head, pulled it down, and kneed him in the head. It was one of the neo-Nazis, or white supremacist, and there was also the case where, and it was a little bit of a tough line though, when the guy Ivanek, something at the top, the guy playing Danvers, he called him an asswipe, and then Bayliss just pushed him down the steps. And then he smashed all the mirrors, so he can get emotional. Bayliss. The other SJs. Over to Jeff.
Well, there's some less developed characters that are probably SJs. As far as leadership positions above G, the colonel and captain roles of Granger, Barnfather, and then eventually Gaffney.
Yeah.
Actually, when we were talking about preparing for these, Ben was trying to find an ESFJ character, and I said maybe Barnfather is, because he's very much, his number one thing is PR and image. So, and there's a few episodes where he kind of shows his softer side. So I kind of got the feeling he's an ESFJ who tries to act like an ESTJ, where he tries to, I'm in this role, I'm supposed to be tough, but little cracks come in there where he kind of, reveals himself as, and not that I'm saying the T's don't have a conscience or whatever, I'm not trying to get into that stereotype or anything, but just in terms of their outward expression, you never got much tenderness from Gaffney.
No, zero.
And really very little from G. Also, every once in a while you get a little bit, but it was certain circumstances. And even when G was being more feelery, I guess you want to say, I think it was kind of more he was going to that part of Guardians where it's the reminiscing part. That's when when STJs can get the most seemingly that way, it's like reminiscing about the good old days kind of thing. So he definitely had some times he did that. In the last couple of seasons, we had some new characters, like Shepard, G's son, Mike Giardello, and both of them could be Guardians. They weren't very well developed characters, but I think Bradley said that, you know, in the kind of environment of a police department, he kind of would go in where default, like they're an SJ until they show otherwise.
Mm.
And in the case of those two, they probably really didn't show otherwise.
If people want to see Barnfather shown a little bit more of his gentler side, maybe it was in the movie. You know, when he was in the hospital.
Yeah, the movie. Also, there was in season 3 when Bolander, Howard, and Felton got shot, and Barnfather shows up, and G basically starts talking before he can say anything, because he thinks he's going to get like a lecture about how many detectives he's using or something like that. You know, because he's so used to getting negative feedback. And Barnfather said, "I came here to tell you that I'm here to help in whatever way. You know, if you need more people, if you whatever, you know." So that was, you know, another moment where, yeah, you could say that's a, you know, a strategic decision or whatever, maybe, but the way they had him do it, you know, the look on his face, it seemed more like a personal thing. Like he's saying, "Look, I understand what you're going through, and I want to help." You know.
So there's a theme in this, folks, of somebody's personality, but then also the role that they play as well. So you got Barnfather is in a role that sort of makes you appear more hard-headed, and you've got G here, who's enacting the role of supervisor as a job, but we also think he's like that anyway. And there's a bit later on where we'll go through him like putting himself in charge in a situation where he's technically not the boss.
Yeah, in the follow-up book, you know, the next book Kersey wrote, Brains and Careers, he talks about how that temperament is temperament, but in terms of the role variance, is sort of like, you could say, on a scale in terms of what someone is most comfortable doing versus something that's more difficult for them. So when it comes to, say, supervisor versus provider, a provider in terms of type can play the role of supervisor quite well. It's going to be not quite as natural to them as it is to somebody who is a supervisor type like G. So G fits the role perfectly because it's what he naturally does in his life. So his job is just more of the same in terms of that's what he fits naturally into. And by nature of that particular role, supervisor, ESTJ, that is so much what they want to be doing that very often they are in jobs where the supervisors, because in most jobs, the people who are assertive and basically take that role naturally end up getting those jobs because they're the ones who want those jobs.
Yeah,
the people that are more informative and less that way are uncomfortable being in leadership positions, so they really don't take them very often. And when they do, they don't usually last very long.
Right, so what we've got here, folks, is this is a little example. And because Kersey's named the types after the job that best suits their talents, there's a little example of that here with, say, G. So we've got G as a supervisor. Hopefully it should focus. Please. Please be kind. Will it focus? Oh, please. There. So you see there, top left, supervisor. And so the one furthest away from him would be my type, designer. And same as Jeff's brother.
Right. So if you think about the character of G and you try to imagine him being in a position where it would be his job to design things, you could say he would be very uncomfortable in that position. That would not be his. He would have no patience for it.
And so here you've got, so this makes it a bit more concrete, folks. They're supervised procedures, and then you've got their design structures. So you can imagine it would be hard for G to be an architect and to always take the client's ideas on board and sort of be submissive to them. And so you've got there, protect belonging, supply material, So we don't want to get too much into this, but
well,
the thing that Jeff mentioned.
If you go back for a second.
Yeah, but this is that thing you mentioned. Okay.
I was going to say one more thing about the one you had up.
This one.
Yeah, in the diplomatic section, conciliate alienates, or alienate, however you say that.
Yep.
That's another kind of funny image if you think about G, because you can think of some people over the course of Homicide who did try to do that, where they were trying to conciliate, whereas G's method is almost never that. He's like going to run the bulldozer over, you know, even in scenes where they're trying to like get confessions from people. You had the time where the guy was confessing, recording his confession, and G's sitting there just staring at him the whole time. And the guy finally says, "Does he have to be here?"
So that would be like somebody like, say, a marriage guidance counselor or family therapist would be that kind of role, sort of sitting back and bringing together alienated people.
Now you can say that gives an opportunity to say that somebody who, like a bailiff, for instance, who most naturally fits the protect belongings thing
or people.
But yeah, more protecting people. But he can do the conciliating thing better than G can. He's closer to that. And so you saw sometimes in certain interviews he was doing with suspects or witnesses, he would play a role of trying to like bring people together or kind of calm them down, or, you know, not always. And somebody who, you know, was a diplomatic type would be better at that than he would, but he's better than G because that's closer to his natural way of being than it is to G.
So folks, if you see the video that has been published on this channel just right before this video, it's called Linda Behrens's Interaction Styles, and it shows how these are similar in terms of how they interact with people. So you've got here, so this would be ISFJ, this would be INFP, this would be ISFP, and this would be INTP. So what we could do is, although we're supposed to be talking about G, we could say that the similarities between Bayliss and Meldrick Lewis, ISFP, and the similarities in their interaction style. Because as you were saying there about, it would be easier for Bayliss to, so these are just the interaction style. Okay, I'll put it differently. These are all the people that are in charge. And so these are like your CEOs of companies. This is like Kellerman. Kellerman takes charge, promotes schemes, although not really schemes in his case. They educate learners. It's like ENFJ. So remember the black guy that was running the cult, and then you got here supervised procedures, the G. So these are all like extroverted or expressive, and they're directive. So they're like their in charge interaction style. What they'll usually do is like talk over people. And one of the signs that Kersey mentioned is that if they talk over somebody and then the other person tries to continue, they'll just steamroller over them. So anyway, so this is that thing that Jeff mentioned about the sort of things they can do. So they find supervising easiest, then the rest, and then there's sort of like they find the other ones harder and harder and harder and harder as it gets further down the tree.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Because this is called personology, and this is sort of a redo of Brains and Careers. So we can go back. I think that's enough of hardcore Kersey theory. We don't want to lose you folks. But yes, what we're saying there is that that ESTJs don't have to just be a supervisor. They can do other things that are, but it depends how far that vocation is away from their natural preference. Is that fair to say, Jeff?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, if we're going to get the whole supervisor description in, we better...
Yep, there it is. It's there. It's your turn now to read it out.
Okay. Where are we at now?
Number 1, paragraph 1.
Oh, okay. So the part we read before that was...
Yeah, I did that one. I did that. That was here.
Okay, so it was before the actual ESTJ description started. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Supervising is making sure that others do as they should do and don't do as they shouldn't do. And some guardians, the ESTJs, naturally gravitate to this role in their relations with others. These supervisors are eager to enforce the rules and procedures, and they can be serious about seeing to it that others toe the mark or else face the consequences. They do not hesitate to give their stamp of approval, nor do they withhold their directions or demands for improvement. Like seasoned, stalwart umpires, supervisors will set their jaw and make the call on anyone who steps up to bat. They even feel obligated to do so, and they're sometimes surprised when others don't seem grateful for their judgments.
Right, so you should be convinced already. We might as well stop the video now.
Yeah, I was about to say, you'll see this all throughout Homicide in terms of G's behavior. And, there's just summing up, when he says things like, close the case, close the case, close the case. He's always telling somebody what to do, not always how to do it. But, he will say how to do it, but he does give some freedom to his subordinates to come up with their own methods. But if they're at all stuck, then he goes back to his tried and true methods.
Yeah.
I think Ben pointed out in the very first episode, or maybe actually the second episode, I guess it is, Ghost of a Chance, where a bailiff is trying to work on the Adina Watson case, and he has a book that's like, the rules for homicide detectives or something like that. And G says, follow the book, follow your gut.
Yeah.
So you can interpret that different ways, but I think at the time we figured it was a two-part instruction. He wasn't saying don't follow the book or don't follow you. He was saying actually to do both, but he's saying basically what works.
Right.
Follow the book, but still if you get a gut instinct for something that's not necessarily exactly what the book says, then go with that too. Because the overall main thing to do is get the case closed.
Because G, folks, is like, he was a cop on the streets. He's very experienced. So, yes, he is by the book, but he has all of this experience that sometimes the book is not right. So, do both. Most of the time, the book's going to be right, but as Jeff said there, well, there was something interesting, but G also stands up for his detectives. Like, for instance, when Frank was trying to get the Adina Watson case from Bayliss, he was G said, I can't do that. That would cut the legs from under him.
Yeah, and it was the boss do that too, saying, Pendleton's the experienced detective, give him the case as the primary. And yeah, he said, I'm not going to do that. So he had definite standards that he would follow. But then, of course, later on, there was a case where he basically did take Bayliss off of it. And it was not one where Bayliss was the primary. It was one Pendleton's primary, but Pendleton didn't want Bayliss to work on it because it was too similar to the Adina Watson case.
Right.
And anytime there was something that was similar, Bayliss would be so emotionally affected by it that he had a hard time working properly. So, G followed that request of Frank's because he knew overall, from a practical standpoint, solving the case was the most important thing. So he's always trying to balance that, like his job and the practical things with, he doesn't want to, he wants to uphold the honor of his detectives as well as himself.
Yeah, but
well as he respects authority. We'll get to that part, of course. But is also, has that conscience of the people working under him. He's supposed to be true to them also. So he always is being kind of pulled in different directions and has to balance that.
I would have replaced Bayliss, and I would have said, yes, you're all equal, but you're a rookie. And I would also say to him, are you going to be a better cop in 5 years than you are now? And he would say yes. Right. So these guys have been here longer. This is a Red Bull. I'm sorry, but we've got to adapt to the situation.
Yeah, and it's likely that if the person in G's position was a utilitarian type, SP or NT, they probably would have done that. Because it would have been, I don't care whether the rookie gets his feelings hurt. The most important thing is solving the case.
What would you have done, Jeff?
This is not portrait of me, but it's hard for me to say because I'm not in that position. So anything I say is like, you know, I'd like to think it's hard for it not to be colored by what happened later too, because Bayless kind of went off the train tracks, you know, later on. But at that time, he was just, you know, he's young and raw. I think I would have said, well, he's still the primary detective, but that doesn't mean that we still aren't having everybody help him. You know, it's the Red Ball case, and Pimbleton does have the experience. I would basically say the same thing that G did when Lewis was trying to investigate Cressetti's death. Even though Bolander was the primary, G gave Lewis permission to basically kind of do his own investigation. He said he didn't think that Stan was pursuing every angle. He was just writing it off as a suicide. So I think I might have said something similar to Frank and been like, look, do everything that you think needs to be done to solve this case, but don't get in Bayless's way and don't directly do something he tells you not to do, you know, because he's still the primary. So ultimately, if he's like, this is what has to be done, but still use your instincts to follow, you know, to lead him where he needs to be led.
But what I would do anyway, if I were in charge, I wouldn't have that system anyway. I would have like a pecking order of based on who I think was good and, you know, who are the experienced coppers. And when it's a red board, it goes to these people. I would have it in a pecking order.
And obviously some police departments do operate that way. And even some that are, you know, fictional ones on television, like NYPD Blue, Law and Order, you can tell on those. And I don't know whether it's a New York City thing or whether those just particular shows decided to do it that way, though I do know they both had consultants that were real cops. You know, maybe in the NYPD they have more of that attitude because you would see the big cases, you know, Sipowicz and whoever his partner was at the time were going to be the ones involved on NYPD Blue. And, of course, Law and Order, you almost never see, you know, any of the other detectives besides the two main ones at the time. You know, if they are, they're just sort of helping them. But, you know, they're taking all the big cases. I mean, so it's kind of like, you know, these are the senior detectives, so these are the cases they get. In reading the book, it seems like in Baltimore it was a combination of both.
Yeah.
They would sometimes do that where they would reassign a case, but it was also another layer of management because there were sergeants that were underneath a lieutenant. And basically, the way it was structured is everybody reported to the one directly above them. So the real G, who's actually D, Gary Diodario, he really didn't come down on his individual detectives much at all. He would do it on the sergeants, and then the sergeants would pass it down to the detectives. Yeah. So if there was a case like that, he would leave it up to the sergeant to make that decision about whether or not he was going to trust somebody to be primary detective. And probably what would happen is that the rookie would still be the primary, because in the case of what the case that the Dina Watson was based on, it was the rookie detective who was the primary, but there was a lot of pressure put on the sergeants to help him solve the case. So that would have been the issue there, is that it would have been on them to say, look, we're still above you, so we can overrule you if we think you're not doing something right, but it's still your case, but we're here to help you.
I would like say, look, your feelings are not important. I'm picking the best person for the case, and I would just do it like that, completely utilitarian. I would have get the people who I know are good and have got the huge experience, because if we don't get this case solved, we're in big trouble. And you can say to them, look, you had to work your way up to be in this place. You had to be on the beat. So you got to work your way up the pecking order. It's just like you have in American football, where you have the veteran players who have more respect than the rookies. Anyway, back to the profile. So hopefully we can maintain this one viewer that we have right now. As a variant of Plato's Guardians and Aristotle's Proprietaries, the ESTJs are little different from other SJs in most respects. Like all the Guardians, they are concrete in communicating and cooperative in using tools. They are interested in learning about commerce, are preoccupied with morality, and work well with material. We'll get back to that morality thing about G talking about things in the past. In orientation, they tend to be fatalistic, pessimistic, and stoical, rather, as they guard the gateways and look to yesterday. G points. They base their self-image on being seen as dependable, beneficent, so actively kind, good deeds, and respectable. Often concerned about things, they trust authority. Even if they're knobs, they still trust them. They trust authority, yearn for belonging, seek security, prize gratitude, and aspire to executive position. They want the promotion. Intellectually, they are prone to practice logistics far more than tactics, diplomacy, and especially strategy. I'll just do a little bit to finish it off. Further, with their tough-minded nature, supervisors tend to take on the administrator's directive role more readily than the soft-hearted conservator's informative role. And with, so what do you reckon about that morality thing there, Jeff? And then also the logistics bit.
Can you be more specific?
Okay, more specific. Do you think there are moments when G would talk about, one of the things I remember that he would talk about in terms of morality was the first time you have a case involving a child, you won't forget it, something like that. And then also when he talked about something like 30 years ago, nobody would have dreamed of killing a cop because they know that they would have been rubbed out, something like that.
Yeah, he talked about like you know, it was just understood that if somebody was caught that they believed killed a cop, that he was gonna get killed himself. It wouldn't even come to a trial because they would make sure he got taken out.
I suppose the other. Go on.
I was just trying to think of some other things that would be brought up. As far as like fatalistic and pessimistic, you know, there's a lot of moments where G's worried about what's going to happen either to his family or to, you know, relationship situations. When we did our overall review, or maybe it was before that, I don't know, we talked about the episode where G talked about being discriminated against by lighter-skinned black women.
Yes, I've got that here. I think, was this the bit where he was get upset with Lewis?
Well, he ended up getting drunk and kind of throwing things around the office and stuff. So I don't think he was really actually upset with Lewis. He was just taking it out on him. But
yeah, and I think he did. Yeah, it wasn't direct, but it was like he just used Lewis as an example of a lighter-skinned African American.
You know, in the stakeout episode, he was talking to Frank and I think at least one other person about the impending marriage of his daughter and how he was offended that she hadn't told him about the relationship until she was getting married.
Oh, sorry, that's for the NFs, Sister Zelda, psychic advisor.
So there was morality and pessimism and fatalism all involved in that kind of attitude, because he had this attitude of, you know, my family is not, I want to be closer to my family, but it's probably never going to happen. You know, the demands of the job keep me away, you know, and he would talk about thinking he didn't spend enough time with his wife while she was still alive.
But they also want that promotion as well. They want to work their way up. So it's a battle between private life and career.
Yeah.
And also there was maybe some pressure on him to work his way up as one of the first black officers that became a detective. Because I remember when he brought that up and he got upset with Shepard. And he was saying, hey, it was brothers like us that made it okay for sisters like you to be able to walk into this police department and be a detective and treated with respect. I think he said something like that, didn't he?
Yeah.
When Shepard accused him of not having the balls to do something.
Yeah.
One of the things... Yeah, go on.
as forceful as he was on some occasions, we saw the stoic part in situations where, you know, he realized that was he needed, as far, you know, as opposed to getting in someone's face. So even though he had moments, plenty of moments where he was getting in somebody's face and yelling and being very forceful, he also had the other moments, sometimes with people who weren't his detectives, but sometimes with the detective themselves. And in my favorite episode, Bob Gunn, he has a couple of scenes like that. You know, one where he's talking to the Robin Williams character, the father of,
Yeah.
or the you know, husband of the woman that got killed, and he's telling him after he had gotten pissed off at Felton for talking about like how much overtime he was going to get on the case and stuff, and telling him he wanted him off the case. So another case where G stuck by his detective, but the way he did it was to tell this guy a story, you know, of like, I remember the first murder case and I'll never forget it, but I don't remember my 40th or my 50th. And Felton is not going to be personally involved the way you are. He's not going to grieve. You know, you don't need him to do that. You need him to find the person that killed your wife. And that's what he's good at. So he's basically telling him, you know, in that situation, he is doing a little conciliation in that situation because he's kind of trying to ease his mind about, you know, what's happening in the police department. And he had other moments where, you know, the end of Kellerman, as far as being a cop, he didn't get up in Kellerman's face and scream about it. He basically, because again, he's torn because he has that loyalty to his fellow police officer, and also the practical side of, this guy's been a good detective for me. He solves cases. But I can't let him continue knowing this is what will probably continue. He's basically always going to have this stigma on him, and we're always going to be at war with Mahoney people if he stays a cop. So I've got to end this, but I also don't want him to go on trial. So he had to find that compromise and deliver that ultimatum to him of what Kellerman had to decide. So he was able to do that in a more stoic way, where, you know, he laid it down of, this is your options. And you could tell he was very pained by having to do that, but he still made himself do it.
In terms of SJs being cooperative and within their community, with Jeff, no, not with Jeff, with G, his two communities are the Italian community and the black community. So that's going to be a big influence on him. And especially when the black community is, I think it's pretty much the majority, or at least the area where he grew up in Baltimore. So Jeff, something that's going to come up quite a bit is logistics. What is logistics for the audience?
Well, it's basically getting what needs to be where it needs to be. So whether that's objects or people, you know, it's delivering the goods, so to speak.
Literally and figuratively.
Right. So, you know, just an example is something like, if you're throwing a dinner party, then you got to invite people, and you got to make sure there's food and, you know, music, or, you know, whatever kind of entertainment you're going to provide, things like that. And they need to all be there at the time that your party is. So somebody's got to make sure all those things happen. That's logistics.
And so we got here for the next paragraph. And with their outgoing expressiveness, they seem to find it more rewarding to act the role of supervisor than inspector. To visualize ESTJ intellectual development, consider the following graph that depicts their most probable profile of their logistical roles. So we got here, if somebody is like a born supervisor, it's best for them to be supervising. You know, if they're naturally bossy, it's best for them to be in a boss position. And the inspector, well, they are bossy, but in a more low-key way. They still want things done their own way. So with Stanley Bolander, then got provider and protector. We talked a bit about those before. So Jeff, do you want to read out number 3?
Supervisors abound, comprising at least 10% of the population. Highly materialistic and concrete, ESTJs believe the table of particulars and the manual of standard operating procedures are what count, not speculation and experimentation, and certainly not fantasy. They keep their feet firmly on the ground and make sure that those under their supervision do the same, whether employee, subordinate, offspring, or spouse for that matter. If others wish to fool around and daydream, fine, as long as they do that on their own time, which means after the job is done. But if they fritter away their time while on duty, they should not be surprised when the supervisor calls them on the carpet. The top sergeant will not put up with such nonsense.
The bit at the top there when it says about how he wants them to stick with the standard operating procedures, I can imagine that when G was first in the job or when he was younger, he might have been a bit more hardcore on standard operating procedures and he would have learned from experience, you know, to give his detectives their head, just clear the case. I don't care how you do it, just do it.
Yeah, that's definitely something I've observed in STJs is that I'm not sure I'd go so far to say they mellow as they get older. I guess maybe ISTJs a little bit more. ESTJs still seem pretty intense even when they're older, but they do, over time, do realize some methods that they see work that aren't necessarily how they used to do things. Like, I think it's the toughest for them to do that. ISTJs it is too, but I think maybe, I don't know what it is about their particular type that they seem to bend a little bit easier, but at least for other people, not necessarily themselves. But ESTJs, it's tougher, but they still do it when they have to. So yeah, the experience shows them things that they don't necessarily go by the book on.
Do you remember that? Yeah, go on.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, remember that retired guy that came out of retirement? He was sort of like short guy, and he was a bit old school, and he'd retired 20 years before. And we talked.
One that was Bolander's old partner.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
And he was saying, and you're saying that although you thought he was SJ, that he thought of some tactics for manipulating the diving team so they would dive for a bit longer.
Diving team.
Jim,
okay, so you're not talking about who I think you were talking about. You were talking about the Irish guy, Finnegan's Wake.
Finnegan's Wake, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking of somebody else.
Could mention that as well.
Yeah, right. He definitely was somebody who you could tell learned on the job ways of dealing with people that weren't necessarily, you know, the by the book kind of ways, but were effective. Sure.
Yeah.
But even that, like I said at the time, he was very old school even in that way. You know, it's like even in the things that he would do, he was still like using, this is what worked in the 70s. You know, kind of like how we talked about Kersey talking about SPs using slang, but all his examples were like from decades ago because he doesn't know the new slang. But by the time you put it in a book, it's already changed again. So.
Yeah, but you think some of those are cool and want to bring them back.
Oh, yeah. There were some hilarious ones, but it's still like most people today would recognize most of those words and phrases because they're not what people are using now.
Yeah.
So even with Finnegan, yeah, it was like, you know, he was still could be effective, but he also was hampered a bit by that in his, like, you know, the racial insensitivity that he showed, like when he was telling his stories and, you know, Lewis got offended at him talking about referring to a black suspect as a spook.
Yeah.
So things like that just would slip out without him even thinking because, you know, his mindset is in the past, you might say.
Yeah, but then also he would actually come out with something that was deliberately hostile when he called when he had a go at Falzone for being Italian. He might have even said Dago or something. But that's more for Spanish, I think. I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm not up with my racial epithets.
That's okay. But anyway, yeah.
So I'll do the next one, unless you have something more to say.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so sociable and civic-minded supervisors are usually pillars of their community. They are generous with their time and energy and very often belong to a variety of service clubs, lodges, and associations, supporting them through steady attendance, but also taking a vocal leadership role. Indeed, membership groups of all kinds strongly attract ESTJs, perhaps because membership satisfies in some degree their need to maintain the stability of social institutions. Like all the guardians, supervisors worry a good deal about society falling apart, morality decaying, standards being undermined, traditions being lost, and so on. And they do all they can to preserve and extend the institutions that embody social order. These guardians are so in tune with the established time-honored institutions and ways of behaving within those institutions that they have a hard time understanding those who might wish to abandon or radically change them. I suppose there's a lot to say there, isn't there, Jeff?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I think we saw in certain episodes G being involved. We got a little bit where he met that woman and he thinks that she rejected him because he was too dark for her. But there was the stuff where it came through about where G sort of mixes in a sort of like a sort of a higher tier of the more accomplished black people in Baltimore, at least in terms of an SJ level.
He knew the wife of the snack food king guy that James Earl Jones played.
Yep.
And the guy who had the newspaper, that ran the newspaper.
And was there also the Colts guy?
Yeah. Yeah, so he...
African Revival thing, I think it was.
Right. So yeah, he definitely, even though they didn't spend a great deal of time on G's social life, you could tell that whether it was through the course of his job or outside the job, he definitely kept up with the movers and shakers, so to speak, in the community.
Yep.
And especially in, like you said, the black and Italian communities that he came from.
Yeah, but it's also, though, because Baltimore is a city with such a large black population, then they are going to be part of that upper echelon, I suppose.
Yeah, and he also, of course, the police community, so he was, like he would do things like go to retirement parties of other cops and things like that.
Probably ones that he knew well.
Right.
And also,
and this part about worrying about society falling apart. He spent a lot of time talking about, like, he would be in his old neighborhood and point to things and say, like, here's where this used to be and here's where that, and now, all this gang violence and things like that. He would talk about what was happening to his community and lamenting, that they hadn't seemed to solve anything in terms of, like, racial relations. In some ways, it was worse.
Yeah. And I might say something like, and now they built a car park on it. Is that something that's not there before? What was I going to say? I was going to say something about, then about respecting about going to the people who retired. And because they're going to be older than him, it would have been people that he would have looked up to when he was younger.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously he's going to want to go to their retirement. But of course there will be ones. There might be the arsehole kind of detectives like Gaffney.
Well, I know he went to the one that was the night shift commander before Russert. Cinta, and he, basically told G that they're forcing me to retire and they'll probably come for you next.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Forgot about that. So, I think... Is it you to read it next or me? I think it's you.
Okay. Supervisors are cooperative with their superiors and carry out orders without fail and to the letter, and they expect the same cooperation, even obedience, from their subordinates or dependents. Rank, they are wont to say, has its obligations, but it also has its privileges. ESTJs are comfortable issuing orders. Telling others what to do is a matter of duty, so demands, commands, requests, and directions come easily to them. At the same time, they may not always be responsive to points of view and emotions of others and have a tendency to jump to conclusions too quickly. And obviously, without failing to the letter, we can see some examples where this was not quite the case with G, where he determined that the orders he was given did not quite line up with his other values. And even in those situations, he would still try to follow them as best he could, but he would sometimes do things that undermined those orders in his own way because he felt like there were principles involved, such as the time that he actually multiple times where he leaked things to the media to try to make things happen when it wasn't getting done the way he wanted it to happen.
Yeah, and it's also, but their default reaction is going to be to respect their superiors. But when they think their superiors are incompetent, and he probably does think Barnfather is a bit incompetent.
Yeah, and definitely Gaffney. But I think, and that's why, part of the reason why he got so upset about, like Gaffney getting promotion over him, it wasn't even as much about him not getting it as it was, this is just one more person you've put over me that I don't really respect, but I'm going to be forced to respect. Because not only is my job say I have to, but I'm just that type of person where I've got to give him that respect. But every time I look at him, I'm thinking, this guy doesn't deserve to be in this position. Why am I taking orders from this clown?
I think it was a perfect choice to annoy G.
Right.
And the guy did do it in order to get back at G, who wouldn't do him a favor.
Right. The Deputy Commissioner Harris said exactly that it was a personal move against G. To put somebody in charge who represented, I forgot the guy's name, but he said basically it was a guy from back when they were, younger days. There was another cop that was a bigoted Irishman. Yeah. And he's like, this guy's, he's just the same as that guy. So that's why I put him in charge of you. So you had to deal with him.
Yeah. Just as bigoted, probably a bit more of a filter.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do the rest. Not always. Oh no. They may not always be willing to listen patiently to opposing views, and are particularly vulnerable to this tendency when in positions of authority. They may need to make special effort to remain open to input from others who are dependent on them, their children, spouses, and employees. What do you think of that? I think that maybe his son touched on that.
Yeah, they definitely in the final season showed that with the clashes with his son, who was not technically his subordinate, but was still supposed to, comply with the department, and they had clashes both on and off the job, but especially on the job. And obviously the personal situation played into it, probably made it more difficult for him, because here he is thinking not only is this guy sort of undermining things as an FBI liaison, but also he's my son. So I'm being undermined by my own son in this situation. So it was like doubly offensive.
Yeah, that is offensive to them.
And yeah, the earlier thing I mentioned about being offended, his daughter didn't tell him about her relationship until she was about to get married, and then just invited him to the wedding. Like, you're supposed to be there. He's supposed to be there, but he doesn't feel like he's been a part of her life.
Yeah, how about? I mean, you could have informed her when they were getting engaged. So, I mean, he probably would have liked to have known that when they actually got engaged. Right, instead of just springing it on me, it's like it's not. I've not even been considered. Do you think it is true that the Guardians really do prize gratitude?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And indications of gratitude more than anything. Like is because so much to me, and I know this comes from my perspective as an artisan. So, you put that filter on it if you want to. But from my perspective, it seems like the appearance of gratitude is more important than actual gratitude, because it's not, and I don't even say that in like a sinister way, like I'm saying all Guardians are fake or whatever. It is so ingrained in them. It's like, this is how you are supposed to respond to this. Manners and things like that, saying thank you, saying you're welcome. Those aren't things that are optional. That's just what you do. And if someone doesn't do that, then it's an insult.
I feel a little bit like that. At least I want them to show the gratitude.
Yeah, but probably with you, it's more about the actual gratitude than it is just the indication.
Yeah, I
Like,
want the
you'd be
gratitude.
satisfied to know that the person is grateful, as opposed to them having to say specific words to you about it.
Oh yeah, if it's a smile of gratitude, that's enough.
Whereas a lot of Guardians seemingly would rather have someone fake gratitude and say the thing they're supposed to say than feel it but not say it.
Especially if it's in front of other people, and it's like,
Right.
see, I'm not the pecking order. I'm getting respect from this person, so they want it. It's almost like, and the other way, if someone apologizes, they want a public apology, maybe in front of other people.
Yeah, especially the the extroverted ones are more likely to want that. I think probably ESFJs most of all, because that's like they seem to be the most image conscious of all the types, and that this is the proper appearance that is supposed to be in this situation. So this is the proper behavior. And if a public apology is called for, then it better happen. And if it doesn't, then you're on the bad list until it does.
But what I would say from knowing from knowing 3 ESFJs is that I think it depends how psychologically mature they are as to how much they need that.
Yeah, and I mean, all of these things. There's obviously, as we've discussed before, your phrase of non-type factors.
Yeah.
I'd say environment
Yeah.
and upbringing plays a big part in how extreme someone is in those areas. But those are definitely patterns that occur a lot
Yeah.
in terms of the attitude that they have towards those things. So this next part says supervisors enjoy and are good at scheduling orderly procedures and in detailing rules and regulations. In their view, things are to be done correctly and established procedures observed. ESTJs put their trust in authority and believe it fitting and proper that government agencies grant licenses and permits only to those passing the scrutiny of sanctioned officials, who are usually guardians of some sort. ESTJs are comfortable evaluating others and tend to judge how a person is doing in terms of his or her compliance with rules and procedures. They may at times be abrupt with those who do not follow the rules correctly or who do not pay sufficient attention to those details that will get the job done right. So multiple times, G looks at the board and makes comments about individual detectives or all his detectives about there's too much red on the board, our job to change red to black, because that is the judgment on how the squad is doing. That's the concrete proof of how is my squad doing, is how much red is on the board.
But I would also think, though, you could have an ESTP supervisor say exactly the same thing, where maybe it's just that role for him. He's a bit more of just get the cases cleared, results versus the actual process of doing it. And that's more probably due to his experience in his just experience of, you know what I mean? He wants to give his detectives their head, but he just wants to like give them a kick up the backside. I don't care how you get it done, get it done. But I can also see an ESTP doing a similar thing.
Well, sure, but I'm talking about this, the part about how tending to judge how a person is doing in terms of his compliance.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
So yes, rules or effectiveness and compliance are not necessarily the same thing, but in this area, he's viewing it as compliance with the rules is that you turn the cases to black. That's what your job is.
Okay, fair enough.
So, yes, there's still methods though. It's like basically whenever like I said before, he gives the detectives freedom to solve the cases, but if they get stuck, he basically says go back to the tried and true methods.
Right.
So there's were cases where he said you're missing something, so you start at the beginning, recanvass, which means go talk to witnesses again, go back to the scene of the crime, look around again, listen, go basically start and go back to your step-by-step procedure for how you start from the beginning, because somewhere along the line, one of those things you didn't do thoroughly enough. Thoroughness is another big, value for guardians. You don't do a job halfway; you do it completely.
So I suppose. So as Jeff says there, folks, the tendency is still there within G to want to do it. There's a particular process. It's just that he will have also learned from his experience to, do it the more of the, we wouldn't use these terms, but the SP improvisational kind of way where.
Yeah, it's like I was saying last week when we were talking to Chloe about the, utilitarian versus cooperator. It's what your first instinct is versus the second thing. And just because the first instinct of cooperator types is to do things the traditional way or the way they believe it should be done by their values, that doesn't mean that they can't then say, what's the most effective way that still doesn't go outside of those things, it doesn't violate my values.
So now, just to bring functions in for a moment, in MBTI and socionics, theoretically, the ESTJs lead with extroverted thinking, which is a very practical kind of thinking, which is results-based, isn't it, Jeff?
Yeah. From my standpoint, I see it as it's sort of like you make an outline, even if you don't physically write an outline, but it's basically like that's the method of thinking. Like you're like, here's the thing that needs to be done. Here are the steps to take it, and you follow the steps in order to get to that.
Yeah, just a bit more on the function. Carl Jung would actually say that it's whatever is objective or is considered as the truth by that society or the consensus. So it's like, this is the consensus for how you do it. And so it's like, that is objective to them, especially to the SJs. These are how things are done. But of course, they can learn from experience. Right, so did you read all of that? Or did you stop halfway through?
No, I read all of number 6.
Right, okay, I'll go on to 7 then. Okay, this type finds success in many occupations which require a high degree of dedication and discipline. Corporate law, politics, police work, military service, and most especially business. So this is good thing about Kersey is that although he starts off each profile by like talking about them in a particular job, so it's almost as if you're reading a job description. Usually what he does in his profiles about halfway through is he talks about the other kinds of careers they can do that's not the stereotypical thing for them. So I always like that about the Kersey profiles. And it's that people forget about when they criticize Kersey, because they'll say, oh, we just write stereotypes. And then we can say, read the whole profile.
Yeah, most of the people who say that have not actually read all of it. And if they did, and they still come to that conclusion, then they're not very good at reading comprehension.
Yeah.
Because he does, especially once you get to brains and careers, because he takes great pains in that book to point out that none of these roles are saying that this person, like if you are best fit role as counselor, that your profession has to be a counselor of some sort. It's not saying you're locked into that. It's saying that is the thing that you're naturally most suited for. And thus, a lot of people who feel that way do gravitate towards jobs that somehow are involved in that because that's what they're best at doing. But it
Or
doesn't mean that even
yeah.
that someone who is a counselor type can't be a professional athlete or a construction worker, or they can be any of these things. It's just saying, he just makes the point that you're going to have to work harder than someone who naturally fits that role better.
And even if they do something that is more associated with another type, they still might act as a counselor naturally in their private life. Or somebody like Jeff, he does do things that show his preference for being a performer, just not professionally.
Right. And so just every opportunity I have, like I do a job that somebody could say would be best suited maybe to an inspector type.
Yep.
And yet I've done it for 13 years now. And I couldn't have done it if it was just the by the book job. I have to have opportunities to have fun doing other things while I'm here, and find those little opportunities to entertain people and perform a little bit. If I'd never had those opportunities, then I couldn't do it. I wouldn't have lasted this long.
It's also part of the challenge that some of the restaurants you have to deal with, without naming names, that are run by SPs. So it's almost like a challenge to get them to do the right thing, and so you have to like improvise a solution.
Yeah, somewhat. And of course, that's added to by the fact that I'm technically not anyone's boss, so I can't directly give someone orders. I can tell them this is what I need done, but it's not my job to actually enforce it. I have to tell someone else if they didn't do something to get them to follow up. So it requires a lot of people skills. So I could say that maybe an inspector wouldn't necessarily be suited best for my job, because if it's an inspector that is particularly reserved, because you have to be able to communicate with people at my job, and with different types of people in different situations, and not lose your cool every time somebody gets upset with you, or you're confronted with something where someone is not doing what you want them to
do. And so it might even be harder for G, if he was a real life person, to do your job, because he would have to do it without ordering them around.
Yeah, because like I said earlier, supervisors, and I don't know if I can't prove this scientifically or anything. I don't have any statistics to back this up, but just from observation in my life experience, it seems to me that ESTJ is the type that the most has to try to get an occupation or a job that's in something where they get to supervise people, because they desire to do it so much. Their whole life is telling people what to do.
Even as little kids.
They can't stand to not be doing that. Yes, even as kids, right. They're the types that are going to, whatever leadership positions there are as children, line leader, the class leader for an activity, the playground monitor, all these things. ESTJs will gravitate towards those roles even as children, because that's what they do so naturally. And they look around and they see people breaking rules or doing what they're not supposed to be doing, and it offends them.
Yeah.
Even as children.
Yeah,
like, that kid is not doing what he's supposed to be doing. This bothers me. I need to tell him to do what's right.
I actually heard this with neighbors, little kids playing about 8 or 9, and the little girl, both of them were given directions to each other. So I think the little boy, about 9 years old, maybe ESTP, and I think the little girl ESTJ, and they both given each other orders, but she's always like referring to the rules, and it says he never referred to the rules. So yeah, you can see this come through in their interaction style and the things they refer to. Oh yeah, so corporate law, politics, police work, military service, and most especially business. The world of business is the ESTJ's natural habitat. They follow routines well, are neat and orderly, are punctual themselves, and expect others to be so. They are loyal to their institutions, are unbelievably hardworking in their jobs, and as we've touched on this in the series, to the exclusion of their private life. And the bright ones frequently rise to positions of responsibility in their company or firm, such as G. And yet, no matter how successful they become, supervisors are always looking for ways of improving themselves taking night classes, attending seminars, reading professional journals, listening to instructional tapes. And so that was actually true of Wojtek's father. When Wojtek said that his father read all the books on a particular subject, and Wojtek initially didn't believe him, but then he thought, yeah, it's probably right, because he was like living in Poland at the time. So do you think that bit's true, Jeff, about that continual self-improvement thing?
Well, I was going to ask you, can you think of examples of G doing something like that? Because off the top of my head, I'm not really remembering something that he specifically was trying to do for self-improvement.
No, I think because he's already at that point where he's pretty high up, isn't he? So maybe if they do the series that I want them to do, the young Giardello, maybe we'll see a bit of that, where he's studying for exams and like hitting the books and stuff and getting that experience. And maybe for him, I think what a young ESTJ might do, they might improve themselves by listening to elders and just getting all their knowledge. What do you reckon about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say on the job that he, he was still trying to get that promotion, so he was, paying attention to what he felt like he needed to do in order to do that. And, I guess some of the comments he would make, like a few conversations he had with Russert, when they were both at the same position, when they were both lieutenants.
Yeah.
On the night shift, one on the day shift. That was probably the closest we had to, because we had the two of them kind of sharing the same rank, so they talked as equals. Whereas most of the time with G, he was either above somebody or below them. So that was one of the rare opportunities where he sort of commiserated with a person at the same level. And they did have a few conversations about like how the politics of the department worked in terms of how people moved up and those sort of things.
Yeah. He was pissed off that she got promoted over him, and he's like, "I've got more experience than her, but you're just doing it for political reasons."
Pissed off at her, pissed off
correct.
At the situation and the way the bosses operated.
So I've written there, so folks can look this up, overlap with Enneagram Type 3. The Enneagram Type 3 is the type that's really motivated by wanting success and wanting everybody to see them as successful as well. And so they're big on self-improvement. I think the next one's for you, number 8.
Yeah, I would say probably from an Enneagram standpoint, G would be more likely to be an 8 than a 3.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Such earnestness and industriousness shows up quite early in the supervisors. They're dependent. We're going to all these things that we already talked about, like the kids, ESTJ kids. They're dependable and dutiful almost from infancy, and they usually respect their parents whether or not their parents have earned it. If, for example, they are punished by a parent, they do not hold it against that parent and are likely, in retrospect at least, to say they deserved it. And in school, ESTJs are usually model students, conscientiously following directions, doing all their homework, doing it thoroughly and on time. Above all else, they wish to do what they are supposed to do, and they rarely question the teacher's assignments, method of instruction, standards, or authority. School, particularly the first 12 grades, was made for them. So since we already did talk about that a little bit, I think probably move on to the next one.
Yeah.
Since we didn't actually see G as a child, we don't have any specific things to cite there.
I actually do think, though, that the ESTJs can actually try to parent their parents if they think that they're not following the rules.
Yeah, and I can think of a specific example that I won't go into right now because we need to move this along, but of somebody who somebody that we both know in the YouTube community that is an INFJ parent of an ESTJ child, and she actually said, asked me as an SP, like, well, how would she rebel, like when she becomes a teenager, or whatever, because ESTJs are, they're supposed to be like this traditional type, they do what they're told kind of thing, and I said, oh yeah, she'll still rebel, but it'll mostly be about what you're doing wrong because you're not parenting her properly.
Yeah.
So
I think this person has a very NF sounding first name. Is that correct, Jeff?
You could say that, sure.
Right. Probably the most NF. Well, in the top tier. At home, these... Did you read all that? I can't remember.
Oh, no, I didn't read 9.
No. Oh, it's 9 for me. I can't remember. Right. Supervisors approach human relations through traditions and rituals, wanting to promote cooperation and contentment in their relationships through well-worked out routines and procedures. Social gatherings and ceremonies have great meaning for them, and they enjoy opportunities to see friends, colleagues, and relatives at functions such as holiday gatherings, weddings, and award dinners. In social situations, ESTJs are relatively easy to get to know. They tend not to confuse people by sending double messages or putting on airs, and they are dependable and accountable.
Yeah, I think this section, probably the next one, not a whole lot of evidence for G because it didn't really show him in a lot of the situations. We talked a little bit about social functions, but they didn't show his home life much. So, the part about like assigning positions in a hierarchy, we didn't really see that at home. We saw it on the job because the show focused on the job.
Right.
But
yeah.
I would say there were certain cases that those things got brought up, like in La Familia, for instance, in the 7th season, because they talked a little bit about some of the Italian side of the family, and some of the sort of the hierarchy of the way those things operated, but it wasn't really delved into very much.
Right. Next one. At home, these tough and outspoken supervisors insist that each member has an assigned position in a hierarchy in so many ways. Go on.
I just said that's what I was just talking about. I was looking ahead to that because I was like, there's probably not going to be much in that section that's going to actually be demonstrated on the show because it's about the home life.
Okay, yeah. In so many ways, they want a place for everything and everything in its place. One of the best SJ sayings. Thus, elders... In fact, you could use that line on them, Jeff, because I know you like to throw it out there every time. Like, a penny saved is a penny earned.
Yeah.
Thus, elders are due both privileges and respect, and older siblings have higher status than the younger. The ESTJ tends to take control of the family and to define roles and duties, especially if they think the parent's a bit off. And you've probably done that quite a bit. As sitcom characters, where the little kid's a bit precocious. Define roles and duties. Spouse and children have certain jobs to do, and it is not enough just to do them. They are to want to do them, and for the right reasons. What do you think about that? Is not much to say on that, is there?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, you had some after the fact discussion of the way G was as a father with his grown children talking about that, but most of it was mainly just about him being very focused on the job and not having much time to talk to his kids.
Right. So the last one, do you want to read the last one out?
Sure. As mates and parents, supervisors are faithful and conscientious. They make sure to remember birthdays and anniversaries and to mark such occasions with appropriate ceremonies and gifts. They worry about their children and take a firm hand in their upbringing, seeing to it that their children become well-mannered, hardworking, productive members of society. Supervisors are especially watchful over their children, some perhaps even over-watchful. Individualism and rebelliousness worry them, and the older their children are, the more closely the ESTJ supervises them, rarely missing a chance to point out the dangers they face in straying from the norm. So I'll say that, again, there's not a whole lot of examples in terms of G's family life in these areas, but there are certainly areas where, in a way, he sort of put himself in a fatherly role, either with his detectives or with people involved in crime in some way. And there was an episode where a couple of teenagers killed somebody on videotape, and on purpose. They were recording themselves doing this. And G kind of had this moment where he sat down, like basically talking about society's downfall, that this is happening in society, and saying something about the parents not, teaching them right or whatever. So that's a very common thing with guardians, where when somebody does wrong things, rather than look at it as that person's of a temperament or personality more likely to do that, they look at it as they weren't taught properly by their parents or their family.
Yeah, and then they'll generalize as well. So it's like they have that. It's like a little bit of NP in them, but people can look that up themselves about the NPs. So this is just a little bit about the Guardians in terms of Do you see here the different roles? Directive and expressive, supervisor. The things that they're interested in there. Although in G's case, not commerce. Morality, material, and then these things here. And Jeff talks about the stoicism. Pessimistic about the future, fatalistic about the past. Gateways. Does that mean about hierarchy and people have to earn their dues, that sort of thing?
Which part?
This bit, place for the guardians.
Gateways. Yeah, I think what he said was something about like that's like they guard the gateways, so it's kind of like protecting tradition or,
right.
or you know, letting people knowing their place, going where they're supposed to go, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's what makes me think about that thing with all of the detectives at the same level would like, I wouldn't do it like that.
Yeah, and that may have been something the show did, like I said, to kind of make it easier on them. They felt like they could tell the stories better that way. Because, like I said, there was a little bit more of a hierarchy in the department that was shown in the book, where there were multiple sergeants and there was more of a little more layers of management. But I guess they decided that they really liked seeing Yaphet Kotto have those direct confrontations with the detectives, and they wanted to keep it that way. So even when they had one detective, Kay Howard, become a sergeant, they never knew quite how to handle that, like what to do with that. They would have certain scenes where they would have G and Howard, talking from that perspective, but it was always a little bit awkward. They never really seemed to come up with a good way of doing that. And apparently behind the scenes, part of that was that Melissa Leo was becoming increasingly frustrated with her role. And she was telling them things in the script that this is not stuff Kay Howard would do or say. And so it was sort of they came to a point of mutual frustration where they decided it'd be better to part ways.
She met the real woman that the character was based on. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I think most of the original cast did meet the people that they were supposedly portraying. And in some cases, a little difficult because it was more than one person kind of amalgamated into one role. Like Corsetti was actually two different people put into one. Same thing with Munch, although he was mainly based on a guy who was actually a sergeant. He was also somewhat part of another person. But some people were pretty close to directly portraying. And obviously Howard was the one female.
So was the character that Munch based on, do you think he was an NT, like sort of like ENTP, or just like using that from the fact that...
I don't know enough about him to know, really. It would probably be better to ask somebody who's actually watched more of The Wire, because apparently they made a more close to the real guy character and even gave him the same name, I think, on The Wire. So, and I haven't seen that, but if somebody who's watched that would probably be able to tell you better whether the Jay Landsman, I think his name is an NT on that show. I don't know.
I think Andrew has watched that show, Andrew Camarillo. So this is a summary, folks, that you can look at of the temperaments. And so we've got some of the old names for them. And so you can see here, if you can pause that, you can see some of the words associated with the types. With the temperaments. So in quick summary, what cozy temperament theory does is it subordinates like the MBTI types to temperament, where temperament is the most important thing. And then we've got some of the images we've gone through. So we've got G. I mean, they probably deliberately put him in the head, but they could have used the same color just for extra this point. And then I think that's him when he's getting upset with not so much Lewis, but as a representative as a lighter skinned African American. And then one of these wistful moments, him being upset, him being angry. Just put that in for a joke because it just thought it was very NF-y. Oh yes, we didn't really talk about this example of G taking charge in a situation where he wasn't actually in charge.
Yeah, obviously we talked about that previously, but that's an example of supervisors type being in charge regardless of whether they specifically are of the people that they're talking to. Because in this episode, there was hostage part 2, and the man who took the hostage has shot a little girl, one of the students, and she wasn't dead; she was wounded. But then he ended up accidentally setting himself on fire. Well, the medical personnel that arrived on scene tended to him first, and G said, "There's a girl here that needs attention," and they said, "We'll get to her in a minute," and he said, "You'll get to her now."
Yeah, I'm putting that in the thumbnail.
Yeah, and then they did.
Yep.
Even though he wasn't actually their boss. But supervisor types tend to get people's attention and tend to get people to do things, even if they're not technically their boss.
Now, so originally Linda Behrens called the in-charge people the take-charge people, but she altered it because of the way people responded to that in a corporate environment. So they do take charge. ESTJs, ENTJs, ESTPs, and ENFJs. Right, so I think that's about, and there's having a reminiscing moments about what it was like in the good old days. So that is about it. So how much of a how well do you think he fits the type, Jeff? 95%?
Yeah, very, very well. Like I said, the only part we're not 100% sure of is the things that are about family, because we didn't see as much of that. But we can certainly extrapolate from what they did show us of his interactions with his children and some of the friends he had, that the family life part would probably fit pretty well too. We just didn't see much of it because that wasn't the focus of the show.
I think what Jeff really pointed out was some of the difference between somebody's preference, their tendency, and then their behavior, which may be different from the profile, but because of experience. And Jeff mentioned that point about he gives their detectives their head, but when they get stuck, he goes back to the procedures and the traditional way to do things. Right, so I think that's about it. Anything else to say, Jeff?
Close the case, close the case, close the case.
Close the hangout, close the hangout, close the hangout. Links in video notes, folks.
If Morgan were here, he would say, G is cool.
Yeah. And it was Morgan that pointed out when G took charge when he technically wasn't in charge, but he put himself in charge.
So there goes to show you that ESTPs can respect and often roll with ESTJs if the ESTP have freedom enough to do their thing. So
yeah.
And I think you saw that a little bit in Homicide too, because Kellerman obviously respected G and G respected Kellerman. You saw the mutual respect there, even if they didn't always agree on how best to do things. You could definitely tell that they had mutual respect for each other.
And what happened with Kellerman is he made that big bang when he first started, because he was beating Pemberton to the punch in certain of his cases. He would be there first, and Pemberton actually respected that a little bit. He was like, "Oh, I got some competition."
Yeah, he was frustrated by it, but yeah, at the same time, it brought out his natural competitive side for sure.
Right, and we'll be talking about Pemberton in future. It will be either next or it will be Lewis. So, bye-bye, folks.
Bye.